Hey yous guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. Today, I'm going to be talking about a Harlem legend. A guy who went to war with Dutch Schultz and went blow for blow with the Dutchman for 3 years. A guy who negotiated a deal with the boss of all bosses, Charlie Lucky, that gave him control of Harlem. If you wanted to open a number spot in Harlem, you better see him first. You wanted to open an after-hour spot, go check with him. Somebody in Harlem got a price on their head and needs to be clipped. You need to give him the opportunity to pick up the contract. Today, I'm going to give you the real skinny on the Godfather of Harlem. I'm talking about Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. But before we get into all of that, if you ain't made your bones, you need to go ahead and bump that subscribe button off. You're hanging around the gang. You ain't made your bones. What are you doing? All right? You want to be serious? You want to be one of the few bad men gang, one of the few bad men button men? You got to knock off that subscribe button. That's the first thing. Second, you got to break that thumb. Everybody knows if you owe a few bad men, you get your thumb broken. That's it. All right? Check out the merch store. Link is down below. New shirts, new cups, all of that stuff. All right? If you want to slide a little envelope upstairs to keep the channel running smoothly, the link is down below. I want to thank my guy, C. Robert G., my top earner for this week. All right? And if anybody else that I missed over the past few weeks, it ain't personal. I just been working a lot. All right? You know, I got much respect for you guys and appreciate you, everybody, for dropping whatever dime they can into the pot to help the channel grow. All right? Is that it? That's all we got to say? All right, let's get into Bumpy. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born October 31st, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, to William and Margaret Moultrie Johnson. Bumpy, along with his 6 siblings and parents, lived in a small 3-bedroom house. The family was poor, but well respected in the community, and they attended church faithfully. Bumpy's father was a fisherman, and his mother was a domestic worker. And Bumpy's mother would oftentimes travel to Brooklyn to work for rich families she met while they were vacationing in Charleston. As his 3 sisters grew older, they began to join their mother when she went to New York. Bumpy lived full-time with his father, and he was intelligent and an excellent student. He was skipped at least 2 grades in elementary school. When Bumpy was 10, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. This was 1916 in South Carolina. The family knew what could happen, but they had no money to get Willie out of town, so they mortgaged the family house and got Willie out of there. By 1919, Bumpy was already showing he had a temper, and the girls liked him. Even some of the little white girls liked Bumpy. This worried his family, so they arranged for him to move to New York and live with his older sister Mayme, who lived on 150th Street near 7th Avenue. Bumpy wanted to get a job so he could send money back to South Carolina to help the family, but Mabel insisted that he attended school. She gave Bumpy a roll of pennies for lunch, and he went to school wearing blue jeans, a starched white shirt, and a red bow tie. On the way to his first day of school, he came across a group of teenagers shooting dice. Bumpy slowed down to observe, and when he was walking away, he heard somebody say, "I know where you can get some money. I bet Country Boy over there got some cash." The tall kid they called 6 and 8 grabbed Bumpy's arm and said, "Hey you, Country, what you got in your pocket?" Bumpy said, "My hand. You got a problem with that?" The kid named Junie said, "Country Boy got a mouth on him." 6 and 8 got closer to Bump and said, "Let me see what else is in there." Bump said, "Man, you don't want me to take my hand out of my pocket, because if I do, I'm going to smash it against your head." One of the other boys named Finley said, "I bet $2 that 6 and 8 kills that boy." One of the other kids named Nat said, "I think I'm going to go with Country. I got a feeling about him." The kid named Junie said, "Hey 6, I turned you on to this guy, so I get half of whatever you get off of him." Bump replied, "Believe me, you ain't going to want half of what he gets if he don't get out of my face." 6 and 8 threw the first punch. Bumpy was smaller, but faster, and he dodged it. It was then that Bump pulled his hand from his pocket and threw a punch that busted 6 and 8's nose, sending blood squirting everywhere. The second punch landed against 6 and 8's head, but he still didn't go down all the way. When Bumpy's third punch landed, copper pennies flew everywhere. Junie then spotted a truant officer and yelled, "Beat it." The boys scattered in different directions, and Nat yelled at Bump, "Come this way or you'll get caught." So Bump turned and ran with the boys, leaving 6 and 8 to face the music all alone. And these boys would keep running together all the way until the end. Finley Hoskins, Jacob Nat Pettigrew, Jameson Junie Bird, and 6 and 8, along with Georgie Rose, Richie Williams, Steve Mitchell, and a guy named Obadiah. These are the soldiers that fought alongside of Bump against the Dutchman's advancements into Harlem. But that's later on. Back to 1919. Bumpy never made it to his first day of school, or any other day after that. Every day when he left out, he would hook up with his friends, and they would try to make $1. Shooting craps, selling newspapers, hustling pool. One day, a diner owner said that they could eat for free if they swept the front of the store. So they did this, and it became an everyday routine. They would meet up at the diner, eat, sweep, and scheme out the rest of their day. Soon they were sweeping several businesses, sidewalks in Harlem, making a few cents a day. Bumpy was the brains of the operation, and it wasn't long before Bump realized that him and his crew could make more money offering protection to businesses in Harlem. So when a new grocery store opened up at 148th Street, Bump and the boys offered their protection to the owner. Problem was, Harlem already had a Godfather, and his name was Bub Hewlett. See, Bub had spent the early 20s fighting against the Irish gangsters who tried to invade Harlem. And when they stopped coming around, he did what the bosses of neighborhoods do. He started offering protection to speakeasies, pimps, pushers, gamblers, and business owners. So when Bub hears about this new grocery opening up, he hopped into his black Lincoln and made his way over to 148th Street to offer his services to the newcomer. But to his surprise, the grocer said he was already paying protection. Bub said, "To who?" And the owner pointed outside and said, "To him." Bub turned and saw Bumpy was leaning against his black Lincoln. Bub said with a laugh, "To that little..." He went outside and he said, "Get off my car, little. You know who I am?" Bump raised up and said, "Yeah, I know. You're Bub Hewlett. Now I'm off your car, so get off my block." Bub said, "Your block? How the hell is it your block?" "'Cause me and my boys claimed it. Or at least we claimed this store. You and your boys got most of Harlem tied up, and now that there's a new store, this one's ours." Now bear in mind, Bumpy Johnson was 16 years old and about 5'8". Bub was a grown man, 6'1", stocky with hams for hands. Bub grinned and said that he understood about youngsters needing to start out and get a start. He said, "Give me a piece of your action here and you can have this spot. We'll be partners." Bump said, "Yeah, okay. Me and my boys, we do our pickups on Sunday mornings. Show up then and you can get your share. Or you could tell us where to meet you and we'll come to you and you can give us our share of your spots, partner." Bub just laughed and drove away. The two would later become good friends and then enemies. Bumpy and his gang began pulling off some burglaries, and they had some floating card games and some crap games. By 1920, Bumpy had saved $200, and when his sister found out about him not attending school, he showed her the wad and gave her half and sent the other half back home to South Carolina. She never bothered him about school again. It was Bub who suggested to Bump that him and his gang offer protection to the many numbers bankers in Harlem. One night in February 1924, Bumpy and Nat were escorting Cuban numbers runner Alex Pompez home from a night out when a gunman appeared from an alley and demanded Pompez's money. Bumpy pulled the switchblade and sliced the man across the face, causing him to drop the gun. He pushed Pompez into the car and turned to the man again, slicing him across his belly. The police heard the commotion, and Bumpy got into a fight with a cop who was trying to speak to Pompez as Nate drove him away. It took a few officers to get Bumpy subdued, and then he was arrested for assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, and attempted murder of the would-be thief. But Pompez was grateful, and he provided the 17-year-old with the best lawyers money could buy. He was only convicted of disorderly conduct and given a year probation. On a side note, this guy Alex Pompez made millions of dollars in the numbers racket in the 20s, all right? But he loved baseball. He helped organize the first Negro League World Series, and he went on to become the international scouting director for the New York, later the San Francisco Giants, and is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's a hell of a second career. Word got around, and soon Bumpy was in as much demand as Bub. But one unfortunate soul would bring them closer. A guy named Yellow Charleston got into an argument at a craps game with Finley and a guy named John Parker after he was denied a loan. And then shots rang out. Charleston shot Parker in the stomach and then aimed the gun at Finley's head and pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. He ran outside where he saw a 63-year-old Harlem hustler named Baron Wilkins standing outside of his club. Charleston ran up to Wilkins, who he barely knew, and told him he just shot a guy and he needs $100 to make the getaway. Wilkins told him he didn't have that kind of money. When Charleston begged him to go inside of his club and get it, Wilkins again said no and turned his attention back to the conversation he was having with his friend. Then again, shots rang out. Charleston shot Wilkins 3 times and turned the gun to his friend, but again the gun misfired. Yellow Charleston ran down 7th Avenue. Parker and Wilkins were piled into a taxi, but they both expired before they reached the hospital. This was bad for Yellow Charleston. He had 2 of Harlem's baddest men on his ass. He tried to kill Bumpy's man Finley, and Wilkins was an old friend of Bub's. The 2 got together and went looking for Yellow Charleston. Later, Bumpy told his wife that they had found him. But what became of Yellow Charleston, only Bumpy and Bub know. A few weeks after the Pompez incident, word got back to Madam Queen, and she hired Bumpy. She was impressed by his intelligence, and soon he became her personal bodyguard, escorting her to plays and concerts. The 2 became close friends. Over the next 5 years, Bumpy would be in and out of jail. First stints in Elmira for burglary and assault, and then Sing Sing for 2 years on a grand larceny conviction. When he got out of Sing Sing in 1932, he was 25 years old, and Dutch Schultz was well into his assault on the Harlem numbers racket. One of the first people to welcome him home was Bub Hewlett. He told Bumpy he was working for the Dutchman and that he wanted him to work with him, and he could get Dutch to give him $200 a week. Bump said while he was in the joint, he heard some Jewish guy was taking over the numbers in Harlem, and he hired some treacherous coloreds to beat up other coloreds. You hear anything about that? Bub said, "You grown now, little. Seems like you smelling yourself. You think you're gonna try me?" Bump said, "Nah, man, I ain't trying to try you, and I don't expect you to try me." He said, "I ain't in this shit, and I don't see no reason to get into it." Bub said, "Good to hear." Bump said, but he couldn't see himself siding with any white man over a black man, but he told Bub to do what he needed to do, and he would do the same. Bub said, "Fair enough, but I'll expect to hear from you what you're gonna do before I hear from anyone else." Bump said, "Okay." They shook hands and parted ways. As for Madam Queen, she said she didn't want Bumpy to protect her. She could protect herself. She wanted Bumpy to run the Dutchman out of Harlem and back to the damn Bronx, or kill him and put him out of his misery. Bumpy tried to explain that what she was talking about was all-out war, and that could cost money. Now, the Queen was not the biggest banker in Harlem, but she was still pulling in $100,000 a year. But they would need to pay men at least $200 a week, plus the ice to keep the police cool, lawyers, and oh yeah, guns, lots of guns. So Bumpy and the Queen called a meeting, and dozens of small bankers came along with some of Harlem's most prominent hustlers. Many bankers said they didn't want to fight, but many said that they would. Some donated money and guns. Alex Pompez, the guy who Bumpy saved back in '24, was now under the Dutchman's thumb. He said he would not fight, but he would donate money. Next, Bump needed soldiers, and he knew where to go. He told Nat, Junie, Finley, and the rest, and they all agreed to take part, except for Finley. He said he wouldn't do any fighting, but he had connections to untraceable guns. After Bumpy got his army together, they were walking down 7th Avenue, and Bump saw Bub Hewlett across the street and told his boys to wait here. And he walked over to Bub and said, "I've been looking for you." Bub put his hand in his pocket and said, "For what?" Bumpy said, "Remember I told you I would tell you first what I plan to do?" Bub said, "Yeah, and?" Bumpy said, "I'm working for Queenie." Bub said, "That's the wrong move, man. Queenie's going down, the writing's on the wall. Bumpy pointed to his crew and said, I guess you can call us a good set of erasers. Bub said, oh yeah? Well, you know you're going to be going up against me and my boys. Bump said, yeah, this is going to get interesting. The two laughed and shook hands. Bub said, I guess I'll be seeing you. Bumpy said, yeah, but I'm banking on seeing you first. They laughed and Bump ran back over to his boys. Now, Bumpy Johnson had his crew, his guns, and enough money, and they began to wage a guerrilla war against the Dutchmen. Soon it wasn't just the black bankers having their men shot up. Schultz's men also began getting shot and killed, and numbers houses under his control were being shot up. Dutch's men were easy marks in Harlem, while Bumpy and his guys blended in. But Bub Hewlett and his boys, that was another story. Bub let it be known that he was gunning for Bumpy, and the two did come across each other a few times, each bared bullet scars from their encounters. But in December of 1932, Bub was arrested and later sentenced to 2.5 years for assaulting a man with a switchblade. In 1934, Bumpy reached out to and got a meeting with Charlie Lucky and told him his side of the Schultz feud and asked for his help. Charlie said he didn't want to get involved, but that if he did get involved, he would want to take over the Harlem's number racket and pay Bumpy a hefty salary. Bumpy said he was disappointed that he wouldn't get involved, but he also told him that if the Italians did try to make a move against Harlem bankers, then he would have to take them on. Charlie laughed and said, you wouldn't survive a war with me. Bump said, that's the same thing Dutch said, and here I am 3 years later talking with you. Charlie laughed and the two shook hands and left it at that. After Bub Hewlett went away, most of his gang stopped fighting against Bump, but a few kept up the fight. In 1934, Dutch imported a tough guy from Chicago by the name of Ulysses Rollins. He let it be known that he was the Dutchman's new colored muscle and that he was going to take Bump down. Bumpy laughed when he heard about it, but he didn't take it lightly because this guy was supposed to be dangerous. It wasn't until the summer of '35 when the two finally met face to face. Bump spotted Rollins in a restaurant at 7th Avenue and 126th Street. Bump pulled his switchblade and jumped on Rollins. The pair tussled on the floor until Bump got up, straightened his tie and sat down. Rollins, however, was still on the floor, his face badly sliced and one of his eyes dangling from its socket. An ambulance took Rollins to the hospital, but this guy was made out of something else, because he left the hospital that same night. With his face covered in bandages, he went looking for Bumpy. He found him at a diner on 125th Street and shots rang out. Rollins fired at Bumpy's head, but the bullet passed through his hat and struck an innocent woman, killing her. An off-duty cop who just happened to be at the diner subdued him and hauled him off to jail. He was convicted of murder and sent up the river. After the Dutchman got one in the gut, courtesy of Charlie the Buck Workman, on the orders of Charlie Lucky, Bumpy and Lucky met again, this time at the request of Lucky. Bump said that he knew he couldn't win a war with the Italians, but he couldn't just sit by and let them take over the numbers racket. But if Lucky wanted to take over the bankers that had sided with Schultz, he wouldn't lose any sleep on any cowards who wouldn't stand up for themselves. Bump wanted to be his partner in Harlem, and that anything the mob wanted to do in Harlem had to be approved by him. The two went back and forth for hours. At one point, Lucky said, you know, I'm doing you a favor. We could just kill you and take over everything. Bump said, you're too smart of a businessman to do that. Lucky laughed. The two men shook hands and a deal was struck. Bumpy was not a man. He was the guy who took on the white man and kept Harlem in black hands. His money was no good in restaurants. All the men wanted to be his friend and all the women wanted to have him. But not everybody was happy. Some Italians didn't recognize the deal struck between Lucky and Bumpy. When some Italian gangsters tried to muscle their way into a black banker, Bumpy got all the bankers together and he called for a work stoppage, pretty much, like he was a union boss. Anyway, the next day, half of the workers working for the Italian bankers called in sick. This caused a 90% drop in income, and 2 days later, Bumpy was called for a meeting with Lucky. Bumpy explained the situation, but Lucky told Bumpy that what he didn't know is that the guy owed the Italians money, and they were in the right for trying to collect. Bumpy said, okay, that's fair, but if you got a problem with my people, come to me first. and 30 minutes later, everything was ironed out. On his way out, Bumpy noticed the chessboard and asked Lucky if he played. Lucky looked at him surprised and said, "Yeah, you? Never mind, I should have figured that. You always seem to have moves planned out 2 steps ahead." Bumpy laughed and replied, "So do you." Lucky said, "Nah, I planned 4 or 5 moves ahead." Bumpy said, "Is that right? You got time for a game?" Bumpy won the first game. Lucky won the next, and they played the next 2 games to draws. This became a regular thing. They would get together at least once a week to play, with Lucky even coming to play Bumpy in Harlem in front of the YMCA on 135th Street. In 1936, Charlie was sent away on a trumped-up prostitution rap. Now, Bumpy wasn't a pimp, per se, but he did offer protection to working girls against pimps who would force them to work for them. That's guerrilla pimping. Now, guerrilla pimping is where a guy would pick out a girl and beat her until she agreed to work for him. Okay, that's guerrilla pimping. Bumpy protected girls from pimps like this for a cut of their money. They could use Bumpy's name and nobody in their right mind would mess with a girl under Bumpy's protection. Well, a guy named New York Charlie must not have been in his right state of mind. He tried his guerrilla tactics against a girl under Bumpy's protection. That's bad enough, but to make it worse, he knew that the girl was with Bumpy. When Bumpy found New York Charlie, he carved him up like a Christmas goose. Afterwards, he went to Small's Paradise for dinner. See, it wasn't personal to Bumpy. New York Charlie was a bad boy. He needed to be spanked. But Charlie didn't see it that way, and he was pissed. So while Bumpy was eating at Small's, 2 officers approached him and told him he was under arrest. They told him that New York Charlie had identified him as his assailant. Bumpy said, "There's got to be some mistake here." He said, "Take me to the hospital so Charlie can admit his error." In Bump's mind, he's going to get there and Charlie's going to stick to the code. But when he gets to the hospital, Charlie was being prepped for surgery, and as soon as he saw Bumpy, he said, "Yeah, that's the motherfucker who cut me." The enraged Bumpy leapt over the doctors and grabbed Charlie by the throat while he laid on a gurney. The cops had to knock Bumpy out with their nightsticks to get him off of him. Bumpy got 10 years in Dannemora for felonious assault. When Bumpy got out in 1947, he had put on some weight. And when his boys asked about it, he said it was all the fried calamari and pasta. He said the Italians ate good up there, and after he helped Lucky out with a situation, he was invited to all the meals. A surprise party was thrown in Bumpy's honor where he received envelopes of cash to get him started. He told his guys he was going to reclaim his area around 135th Street and open a number spot. Junie said, "Man, things done changed. The Italians got everything all tied up now. They might not even let you open a spot." Bumpy said, "Let me open a spot. Since when do I need permission from a greaseball to open a spot?" Junie said, "Like I said, things have changed. Nowadays, no one opens a spot without permission from the East Side Harlem Italians." A few days later, Bump met with Joe Adonis. Joe Adonis was a close friend of Charlie Lucky. Charlie trusted him to handle business on his behalf after he was deported back to Italy in 1946. Adonis couldn't make it to Bumpy's homecoming for obvious reasons, but he sent word that he had something for him. And when Bumpy went to go see Joey gave him $6,000 and keys to a new Lincoln. He thanked him and said he preferred Cadillacs. Joey said, "No problem. Take the Lincoln for now, and in a couple days I'll have a caddy for you." Bumpy thanked him, and then he told Joey that he was thinking about getting back into business, that he was opening up a number spot. Joey asked if he got permission from our friends. "Did you talk it over with them?" Bump said, "Man, I don't need to talk it over with nobody. I'm going back into business for myself like always." Joey said that he would set up a meeting. Bumpy and his boys went to meet the Italians at the Palmer Social Club on 115th Street near Pleasant Avenue on the east side of Harlem. Bumpy didn't think there would be any problems, but just in case, him and his boys came heavy. Seated at a table was Joe Adonis, Fat Tony Salerno, who was now in charge of the numbers racket, the Harlem's number racket for the Genovese family, and one of the most psychopathic individuals in mob history, Trigger Mike Coppola. Fat Tony welcomed Bumpy. He was a man who had earned their respect, and what did he have planned for the future? Bumpy said that he appreciated the gifts and that he didn't want to impose any more on their friendship. and he was just going to open up his spot at 135th Street and he could take care of himself. Tony said, "That won't be as easy as that. See, everything runs through us now. You want to open up a spot on 135th Street? Fine, but your numbers run through us and we'll give you a good cut. You've earned that respect." Bump said, "Then I expect you to honor the deal that was made." Tony replied that the deal was cut with some friends who are no longer in charge. The people at the head of the table have changed, so the deal had changed. You want to do business in Harlem? You do it through us. Bump said, "Well, I guess this meeting's over." He looked to Adonis and said, "You need to get word to our friend and let him know that I am not happy with this." Adonis said, "You're trying to give me orders, Bumpy?" Bumpy said, "No, I would not presume to give you orders, just like you know I won't be taking any orders. But I am requesting that the next time you meet with our friend, you give him my best regards and inform him on what's going on." Adonis said nothing, but nodded his head. Bump and his boys went back and prepared to go to war if it came to that. But times were different. Some of the guys had gone to business and worked for the Italians, like 6 and 8. He didn't want to fight. But Nat, who was also working with the Italians, said, "Fuck that. Tell me which one you want knocked off first and I'll go do it now." But it never came to that, because Joey A did let Lucky know what was going on. And Lucky sent word from Naples that the deal had to be honored. And not only that, but Bumpy was to be given anything he wanted. You see, back in Bumpy was in Dannemora with Charlie, a guy tried to shank Lucky in the yard. Bump pushed Lucky out of the way and beat the guy senseless. Bumpy's relationship with the Pleasant Street boys was cordial at best. They left him alone, and he left them alone. But one time, Italian gangsters came uptown and snatched a guy named Pop, who had messed up bad, and they took him for a ride. Pop happened to be the head coach of the Harlem Globetrotters at the time, and when Bump heard about it, him and his boys jumped into their Cadillacs and took off. When they returned, they had Pop with them, shaken but unharmed. The same can't be said for Bumpy's longtime friend, 6 and 8. In September 1948, Tony Zale, the middleweight champ of the world, was defending his title against Marcel Cerdan in New Jersey. Cerdan was a Frenchman, and he was a huge underdog. Bump and the boys were going to the fight, and some Italian gangsters that 6 and 8 worked for gave him $2,000 to bet on Cerdan. 6 and 8 thought they were crazy, and he came up with a plan to make some money. He put the $2,000 they gave him on Zale, and when Zale won, he would keep the cash. But when Zale didn't answer the bell for the 12th, Cerdan became champion, and 6 and 8 became gray. Bumpy knew that 6 and 8 was screwed, and he advised him to leave New York. But 6 and 8 told Bumpy that he would talk to them and explain what happened and give them $2,000 from his number spot. Bumpy said, "Are you crazy? They're going to want the money they would have won if you had done what you were supposed to do, and they're going to kill you if you don't have it." 6 and 8 said that he was tight with the Italians, and he told them not to worry, he would handle it. He didn't, and a week later, 6 and 8 was laying on 150th Street filled with lead. Shortly after Bump was released from jail, he met and married Mayme. The couple would move into a 3-bedroom apartment on 120th and 5th Avenue, along with Mayme's daughter Ruthie and Bumpy's daughter Elise. See, back in 1935, before Bump went away for slicing up New York Charlie, he showed up at his sister's doorstep and had a baby who appeared to be white, and told Margaret that he needed her to take care of the baby. She protested, but Bump said that he would give her $12 a week plus expenses. In 1948, Bump was introduced to a kid named Flash Walker by Pop, the same Pop who Bumpy had saved from the Italians. He told Bumpy that Flash really could use a job. The kid was broke. He didn't have 2 dimes to get a meal, and he was walking around in the snow with holes in his shoes. Bump said he didn't have anything for him. Pop said, "What about around the house? I'm sure your wife could use a hand." Bump said, "Send him over tomorrow. I'll see what I can do." Bumpy brought Flash home that next day and introduced him to Mayme. Bump and Mayme instantly took a liking to the young man. Bump never had a son, and Flash never had a father figure in his life. The two quickly became close. At first, his chores were around the house, but after a while, Flash started asking Bumpy to put him on at his number spot. After initially saying no, Bumpy relented, and he wasn't disappointed. Flash quickly became one of Bumpy's best runners. He had a way with words, and he would charm people into betting more than they would normally. Flash began to come over for dinner and was becoming like a part of the family. This didn't sit too well with the girls. They were jealous of Flash and Bumpy's relationship. Once, when Flash showed up at Bumpy's with a really bad cough, Bumpy and Mayme thought he may have TB and took him to the hospital. That's when they found out that Flash was homeless and he was sleeping on a pool table at Pop's. Luckily for Flash, it was just pneumonia. Later that night, he signed himself out of the hospital. Wearing just a robe and sneakers, he walked the 15 blocks to Bumpy's and collapsed in Mamie's arms when she opened the door. He told him that he had never had a family. He was abandoned on the steps of an orphanage as a baby, and the past 2 weeks with Bumpy had been the best 2 weeks of his life. And he didn't want to lose that over a stupid cold. Bumpy and Mayme moved the girls into one room and gave Flash the other. Soon Flash became Bumpy's driver and bodyguard. He also did collections for Bump. You see, Flash was a former boxer, and he was good with his hands. But he had one problem. He had a bad habit of falling asleep whenever he got hit. The kid had a chin like fine china, but that didn't matter, because when he was with Bump, no one hit back. Bumpy loved Flash like a son, and Flash felt the same. And he was quick to administer a beatdown to anybody he felt was disrespecting his new father. Now, if this story sounds familiar to you, it's because it's the story that Frank Lucas stole and used for his own. All right. Contrary to American Gangster, Bumpy Johnson said she never met Frank, and he never lived with her and Bumpy. Frank Lucas used Bumpy's name and stole Flash's story to bolster his own criminal reputation. He said that he was Bumpy's driver for 15 years, but Bump was never out of jail for 15 years straight as an adult. There are a lot of things wrong about that Frank Lucas story. Maybe I'll do a video on the things that gangster movies got wrong. Let me know down in the comments if you want to see that. Anyway, Flash was Bumpy's man, and Flash began to use Bumpy's name around Harlem, and he began to feel himself. One day at a bar, he ran into a cop that had arrested him for disorderly conduct. Officer Johnny Jenkins was just there talking with a friend when Flash approached him and said he was nothing but a punk. "Let me see you try and fuck with me now. I got something for your ass." The officer knew he was with Bump, so he tried to ignore it, but Flash wouldn't stop. When the officer tried to get past Flash to leave, the young gangster threw his drink in his face. That was too much. The officer grabbed Flash by the collar and slammed him against the bar and began punching him in the face. Flash fought back until the officer pulled his gun and pointed it at Flash's chest. So who happened to walk in at that very moment but Bumpy? Bump saw what was happening, and he pulled his own gun and placed it at the head of the officer. Until Junior yelled at him to stop, Flash had instigated the entire thing. Now, Junie, Nat, and the rest of Bumpy's gang didn't like Flash too much, but they tolerated him because they knew how Bumpy felt about him. But after the cop incident, they told Bump he should let Flash go because he was going to end up doing something that he would regret. And they were not wrong. In October 1950, a pimp Flash had done time with came home, and he told Flash about a scheme he had. He had been getting money from a rich girl who was the daughter of a prominent politician. The family found out about it, and they put an end to it, but not before he lifted the checkbook out of the girl's purse. He assumed that she was so loaded and irresponsible with money that she would never miss it. All he needed was a way to cash the checks. Flash had an idea. He could write the checks out to cash, and Flash would take the money from Bumpy's spot and put the checks into his bank account. At first, everything was running smoothly. They made sure that the checks were no bigger than $200. But then they got greedy. They started cashing checks for $700, $800 at a time. It wasn't until 4 months later, Bumpy received a call from his bank asking him to come and discuss his account. The bank president took Bumpy to a private office where he was introduced to the girl's father. He accused Bumpy of stealing from him and threatened to get the police involved. But Bumpy didn't know anything about this, and he said that getting the cops involved would be bad for both of their careers. He promised to get to the bottom of this, and that no more checks would be cashed against his daughter's account. Bumpy was furious. He stopped by his apartment to tell Mayme what happened before going to confront Flash. He was pissed and pacing the room, yelling about how Flash could have gotten him into serious trouble. It was then that 16-year-old Elise and Ruthie, who heard the whole thing, came from their rooms. Ruthie blurted out, "Bumpy, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to tell you that when Flash was here earlier, he patted me on my butt. Bump said, he did what? Mayme said, why didn't you tell me this? I was here all day with you. Ruthie said she wanted to tell Bump herself. Bumpy was breathing hard and turning deep purple. Mayme was trying to calm him down when Elise said, he did the same thing to me, Daddy. Patted me right on my butt. And he said he couldn't wait to get me alone. And it wasn't the first time that he did this. Mayme said, Elise. She tried to calm Bumpy down, but it was too late. He was already out the door to go find Flash. Now, whether or not Flash actually touched the girls, no one knows but them. But Mayme didn't think so. She believed that the girls were jealous of Flash and saw that Bumpy was angry at him and saw this as an opportunity to get him out of their lives. But I'm sure they did not expect the chain of events that would unfold because of their words. When Bumpy jumped out of his caddy in front of the Teresa Hotel where Flash was now staying, Flash was just coming out of the hotel. He saw Bumpy and smiled and started walking towards him. Then Flash noticed Bumpy's anger and said, what's wrong, boss man? Some shit went down we gotta take care of? Bumpy never said a word. He just hauled off and punched Flash, knocking him down. Then he began to pummel the young man and cursing him. I trusted you and you shit on me. Bumpy gave Flash a savage beating right on 7th Avenue. Flash never fought back. Bump stood over him breathing heavily and he said, stay the fuck away from my girls or I'm gonna kill you next time. Bumpy hopped back into his caddy, leaving Flash lying in the gutter between two cars, unrecognizable. Now why Bumpy did this, I don't know. He knew that his girls were not angels. In fact, the 16-year-old Elise already had a daughter named Margaret. Bumpy had to arrange a shotgun wedding to some sap who probably wasn't the father. But he did it, and it would come back to haunt him. Okay, now contrary to popular belief, Bumpy Johnson never sold dope. Not that he didn't profit from dope. After all, he was the boss of a neighborhood, and anyone involved in criminal activities had to pay Bump for the right to be a criminal. And yes, he did go to jail for selling heroin, but I'm going to explain what really happened. For days, Flash called, every hour and on an hour. But whenever Bump heard his voice, he would hang up. Bumpy's boys Nat, Junie, and Finley told him to be careful, that Flash was going to come back at him. Bumpy wasn't worried, but he had hurt Flash, not just physically. And after weeks of not talking to Flash, and people telling Bump that he should make up with Flash, Flash became bitter. He had lost the only father he ever had. In December of that year, Flash was arrested for selling a small amount of heroin. He said that he was selling for Bumpy. Flash said that Bumpy sent him to get a package from the Italians and sell it to someone else who turned out to be an undercover agent. But New York narcotics agents were not buying it. The word they had from the streets was that Bump didn't sell dope. Plus they knew about the beating that Bumpy gave Flash. But the feds stepped in and wanted to get Bumpy so he could flip on the Italians who sold dope. Flash tried to get a girl to plant drugs in Bumpy's apartment, but she revealed the story to Bumpy. Later, in May of '51, Bump was arrested by narcotics agents in front of his building. It was said that Flash was up on the avenue telling everybody, laughing and telling everyone that Bumpy had gotten pinched. The feds told Bump that if he gave up some big names, it would all be over. But Bumpy didn't fold. He was no rat, and he knew he was innocent, and that they had nothing on him. Bumpy got out on bail, and while he was awaiting trial, it was business as usual. Until June of 1952, when a drunk pimp named Roger Hawkins, known in the streets as Hawk, entered the after-hour spot Bumpy was in, and he started bragging loudly about all the money his bitches had made for him that night. Bumpy didn't like men using foul language around women, and he said to him, "Man, why don't you cool out? Can't you see there are women in here?" Without looking, Hawk said, "Man, who the fuck is you to tell me to cool out?" Bumpy said, "I'm about to be your worst nightmare if you don't get your butt out of here." Hawk turned and saw that it was Bumpy Johnson, and he stumbled over chairs to leave while being laughed at by the other patrons. The embarrassed Hawk went and got even drunker and returned to the bar a few hours later armed with a revolver that he borrowed. He said, "What you got to say now? You so bad, what you got to say now?" Now Bump was out on bail and he was unarmed. Hawk had him up against the bar and Bump said, "Man, why don't you just go home and sleep it off? You were wrong and you got called out on it and it's over now." Hawk said, "Ain't shit over." Stepped back and prepared to fire, but Bump was able to grab a potted plant and hit Hawk just as he squeezed the trigger. And instead of being shot in the head, he caught one in the right side of the chest. Hawk fired twice more into Bumpy's belly before running off. But Bumpy was able to make a full recovery. Hawk left town that night and was never seen again. The shooting postponed the trial until the next year. When it did commence again, the feds brought out lying witness after lying witness. And even though Bumpy knew he was innocent and felt he would get acquitted, he still made preparations to have his family taken care of. But he was found guilty. Even after trying to bribe a judge $100,000 for a lesser sentence, he was sentenced to 15 years. Bump was so adamant about his innocence that he appealed the case all the way to the Supreme Court, but they refused to hear the case. Bumpy spent some of his time in Atlanta and some of his time in Alcatraz. He was not a model inmate, and he got dozens of write-ups and spent half of his time in solitary. He was such a problem that no warden wanted him, so he was released on mandatory release after 10 years. Bump could have gotten out earlier, but he refused to pay the fine imposed on him by the judge as part of his conviction. Bump had the $9,000, but it was the principle. He didn't want to be seen as a dope peddler. It took Mayme coming to Lewisburg Penitentiary and demanding that Bump cut it out that he folded. And after his boys paid the fine, Bumpy was released on May 1st, 1963. Bumpy returned to Harlem to a hero's welcome. Cars and people lined 135th Street, and people threw confetti out of windows. Junie, Finley, and some of the other guys were still around, but Nat was locked up and wouldn't get out until after Bumpy died. Bumpy didn't get back to business. Well, he did, but not the way he was doing it before. He still had spots running the whole time he was away that kept Mayme and the kids taken care of. No, he got into a legitimate business, and he started a company that supplied chemicals to exterminators. Bump, along with Mayme and Margaret, moved into the Lenox Terrace, and Bumpy began to hold court at a club on 135th Street. There he could be found talking with important people, politicians, business owners, and anyone who need help in Harlem. Bumpy was the man to see, still. Okay, now let's go back to the 40s for a second, while Bumpy was in Dannemora. A small-time hood named Malcolm Little made his way to Harlem from Boston. He was a zoot suit, perm-wearing cat who went by the name of Detroit Red because of his conch red hair. Now, if you don't know what a conch is it's like a perm. You know, it's a relaxer. And what Nat King Cole's hair used to be, all right? You see what a conch is, and Cab Calloway, all right? It's lie. It's basically what it is. It's lie. And it straightens your hair, all right? If you ever seen Malcolm X, you know what I'm talking about. All right. Detroit Red had tried his hand at pimping, burglaries, and numbers. He fled Harlem in 1947 after having a beef with a numbers banker named West Indian Archie. During his stay in prison, he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and became a follower of Elijah Muhammad, a self-proclaimed prophet of God. Malcolm Little became Malcolm X, and in 1963, he met Bumpy for the first time. Okay, now in Godfather of Harlem, it says that they were old friends, and that's BS. Bumpy did admire him for his stance against black oppression in America, but he never got the Nation of Islam involved in any wars with the Italian Mafia. When Malcolm broke away from the Nation of Islam, after finding out that Elijah Muhammad was not who he said he was, and had several children with several women, some of which were underage, Malcolm started his own movement, but he was constantly threatened by the nation. Bumpy offered to protect him, but Malcolm passed on it. Malcolm was assassinated on February 21st, 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem by members of the Nation of Islam. After Malcolm's passing, Bumpy raised money from Harlemites and gave it to Malcolm's widow, Betty Shabazz. It was around 1965 when Bumpy was introduced to Frank Lucas, and he was Bumpy's gopher and errand boy. He was not his most trusted bodyguard. So, all right, so if I'm going to give you the goods, I got to give you the bads, all right? We established that Bumpy never sold dope, right, heroin. But he was arrested in 1965 for drugs, but it wasn't heroin. Bumpy had financed the cocaine smuggling ring. And not to make excuses for Bump, but at that time, heroin was destroying lives and neighborhoods, and cocaine was seen as a party drug, and it wasn't addicting. So they thought. All right. Bumpy set up a network getting powder, right from Bolivia, and it cut the Italians out, who had previously been bringing it in. Bumpy believed it was them who tipped the cops off, and when the cops came to arrest him, he led them on a high-speed chase through Harlem. He was released on bail, and it was business as usual while he awaited trial. But Bumpy would never stand trial on this cocaine case. You see, back in Alcatraz, Bumpy found out that he had a bad ticker. And starting in 1967, Bumpy would have several heart attacks. He recovered each time. Bump still held weight in Harlem, and after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Harlem erupted. The mayor came to Harlem and tried to get the mob to stop. They threw rocks at him. Later he returned with Bumpy, and no rocks were thrown. The looting and the riots stopped in Harlem days before the rest of the black communities in America. Late on July 6, 1968, Bumpy was lying in the bed restless. He got up and told Mayme he was going to a card game. Mayme told him that he looked like hell. He shouldn't go out. But Bump assured her that he was okay. On the way downstairs, the elevator stopped and Junie got on it. Him and his wife had moved into the building that Bump and his wife had lived in. He also told Bumpy that he looked like shit. The two argued about Bumpy going out before Junie offered to give him a ride to the game. On the way, Bumpy made Junie promise him that he would look after Mayme if anything happened to him. Junie said nothing's going to happen to you. He let him know that he had his back forever. It only took a few hours for Bump to lose all the money he brought out. At 1:30 a.m., he made his way to Wells' restaurant, which had been a Harlem staple since it opened in 1938. When he arrived, it was about 2 a.m., and Finley was there at the counter with a guy named JJ. Bumpy waved and said, "What are you doing here, Finley?" Finley said he had cleaned his crap game out early. Bump took a booth with his pal Patty, who had walked over with him from the card game. He ordered a coffee, a chicken leg, and grits. But as Bumpy put the grits to his lips, his face grimaced and he grabbed his chest. He fell over, and a nurse who was at the restaurant ran over and began massaging his heart. Finley ran over and put cold ice on Bump's head. Someone yelled, "Get an ambulance." Finley said, "Fuck an ambulance. Get Junie. He's next door." Junie rushed in, but the nurse said it was too late. He was gone. Junie ignored her and scooped Bumpy up and said, "I got you, man. Don't worry, I got you." Bump looked at him and gave him a little smile and closed his eyes. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the Godfather of Harlem, was gone. He didn't die in the streets at the hands of the Dutchmen or get taken for a ride by the Italians. He died in the arms of two of his best friends in Harlem. Thousands of people came to Bumpy's funeral at St. Martin's Church, and the streets were lined with people as his mahogany casket made its way through Harlem. Reverend John H. Johnson said in his eulogy that Bumpy chose his course and he followed it with his eyes open. And that is the skinny on Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the Godfather of Harlem. Now, as you can see, he didn't get out of Alcatraz and go looking for the doogie or have fist fights with Chinjiganti. All right, as far as I know, Chinjiganti was down in Greenwich Village. That's his area. Harlem would have been Fat Tony Salerno's anyway. The Chin wasn't the boss of the Genovese family at that time. Vito Genovese was still alive. And he may have been the boss down in the Greenwich Village area, but he was not the boss in Harlem. All right. And a lot of that is BS. Also, we learned about Frank Lucas and his lying self. All right. A lot of stuff he did. He just did a lie. The movie was great. All right. The story was good, but it's a lie. All right. Let's get to the top earners this week. Got my guy, C. Robert G. Thank you very much. Alvin Sanchez, thank you very much. And anybody who bought something from the store, I've greatly appreciated. Go check out the merch store. All right. Anything else? If I did miss you because you may have donated on an older video, I'm not ignoring you. I just didn't see it. But I do thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. All right. Again, if you're one of the new subscribers over this past month, leave a comment down there so we can welcome you to the gang. Okay? I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. This has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean And don't take any wooden nickels. I see is in the funnies.